throwing more sand in the eyes of the Austrians, trying to figure out how many men he had available. When Masséna unexpectedly surrendered, Napoleon realized that it would be easier now to bait Mélas into attacking his divisions, particularly if he moved them closer. At Marengo itself, he knew all along that his first reinforcements would arrive sometime after 3 in the afternoon. The more disorderly the Austrian pursuit of the French, the more devastating the counterattack would be. Napoleon's power to adjust and maneuver on the run was based in his novel way of planning. First, he spent days studying maps and using them to make a detailed analysis. This was what told him, for example, that putting his army at Stradella would pose a dilemma for the Austrians and give him many choices of ways to destroy them. Then he calculated contingencies. If the enemy did X, how would he respond? If part Y of his plan misfired, how would he recover? The plan was so fluid and gave him so many options that he could adapt it infinitely to whatever situation developed. He had anticipated so many possible problems that he could come up with a rapid answer to any of them. His plan was a mix of detail and fluidity, and even when he made a mistake, as he did in the early part of the encounter at Marengo, his quick adjustments kept the Austrians from taking advantage of it. Before they'd figured out what to do, he was already somewhere else. His devastating freedom of maneuver cannot be separated from his methodical planning. Understand, in life, as in war, nothing ever happens just as you expect it to. People's responses are odd or surprising. Your staff commits outrageous acts of stupidity. On and on. If you meet the dynamic situations of life with plans that are rigid, if you think of only holding static positions, if you rely on technology to control any friction that comes your way, you are doomed. Events will change faster than you can adjust to them, and chaos will enter your system. In an increasingly complex world, Napoleon's way of planning and maneuvering is the only rational solution. You absorb as much information and as many details as possible. You analyze situations in depth, trying to imagine the enemy's responses and the accidents that might happen. You do not get lost in this maze of analysis, but rather use it to formulate a free-flowing plan with branches, one that puts you in positions with the possibility of maneuver. You keep things loose and adjustable. Any chaos that comes your way is channeled toward the enemy. In practicing this policy, you will come to understand Napoleon's dictum that luck is something you create. 2. As the Republicans prepared for their convention to pick a presidential candidate in 1936, they had reason to hope. The sitting president, the Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt, was certainly popular, but America was still in the Depression. Unemployment was high, the budget deficit was growing, and many of Roosevelt's New Deal programs were mired in inefficiency. Most promising of all, many Americans had become disenchanted with Roosevelt as a person. In fact, they had even come to hate him, thinking him dictatorial, untrustworthy, a socialist at heart, perhaps even un-American. Roosevelt was vulnerable, and the Republicans were desperate to win the election. They decided to tone down their rhetoric and appeal to traditional American values. Claiming to support the spirit of the New Deal, but not the man behind it, they pledged to deliver the needed reforms more efficiently and fairly than Roosevelt had. Stressing party unity, they nominated Alf M. Landon, the governor of Kansas, as their presidential candidate. Landon was the perfect moderate. His speeches tended to be a little dull, but he seemed so solid, so middle class, a comfortable choice, and this was no time to be promoting a radical. He had supported much of the New Deal, but that was fine. The New Deal was popular. The Republicans nominated Landon because they thought he had the best chance to defeat Roosevelt, and that was all that mattered to them. During the nominating ceremony, the Republicans staged a Western pageant with cowboys, cowgirls, and covered wagons. In his acceptance speech, Landon did not talk about specific plans or policy, but about himself and his American values. Where Roosevelt was associated with unpleasant dramas, he would bring stability. It was a feel-good convention. The Republicans waited for Roosevelt to make his move. As expected, he played the part of the man above the fray, keeping his public appearances to a minimum and projecting a presidential image. He talked in vague generalities and struck an optimistic note. After the Democratic convention, he departed for a long vacation, leaving the field open to the Republicans, who were only too happy to fill the void. They sent Landon out on the campaign trail, where he made stump speeches about how he was the one to enact reforms in a measured, rational way. The contrast between Landon and Roosevelt was one of temperament and character, and it seemed to resonate. In the polls, Landon pulled into the lead. Sensing that the election would be close, and feeling that this was their great chance, the Republicans escalated their attacks, accusing Roosevelt of class warfare and painting a bleak picture of his next term. The anti-Roosevelt newspapers published a slew of editorials attacking him in personal terms. The chorus of criticism grew, and the Republicans watched gleefully as many in Roosevelt's camp seemed to panic. One poll had Landon building a substantial lead. Not until late September, a mere 6 weeks before the election, did Roosevelt finally start his campaign. And then, to everyone's shock, he dropped the nonpartisan presidential air that he had worn so naturally. Positioning himself clearly to Landon's left, he drew a sharp contrast between the two candidates. He quoted with great sarcasm Landon's speeches supporting the New Deal, but claiming to be able to do it better. Why vote for a man with basically the same ideas and approach, but with no experience in making them work? As the days went by, Roosevelt's voice grew louder and clearer, his gestures more animated, his oratory even biblical in tone. He was David facing the Goliath of the big business interests that wanted to return the country to the era of monopolies and robber barons. The Republicans watched in horror as Roosevelt's crowds swelled. All those whom the New Deal had helped in any way showed up in the tens of thousands, and their response to Roosevelt was almost religious in its fervor. In one particularly rousing speech, Roosevelt cataloged the moneyed interests arrayed against him. "Never before in our history," he concluded, "have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred. I should like to have it said of my second administration that in it these forces met their master." Landon, sensing the great change in the tide of the election, came out with sharper attacks and tried to distance himself from the New Deal, which he had earlier claimed to support, but all of this only seemed to dig him in a deeper hole. He had changed too late, and clearly in reaction to his waning fortunes. On Election Day, Roosevelt won by what at the time was the greatest popular margin in U.S. electoral history. He won all but 2 states, and the Republicans were reduced to 16 seats in the Senate. More amazing than the size of his unprecedented victory was the speed with which he had turned the tide. Interpretation. As Roosevelt followed the Republican convention, he clearly saw the line they would take in the months to come. A centrist line, emphasizing values and character over policy. Now he could lay the perfect trap by abandoning the field. Over the weeks to come, Landon would pound his moderate position into the public's mind, committing himself to it further and further. Meanwhile, the more right-wing Republicans would attack the president in bitter, personal terms. Roosevelt knew that a time would come when Landon's poll numbers would peak. The public would have had its fill of his bland message and the right's vitriolic attacks. Sensing that moment in late September, he returned to the stage and positioned himself clearly to Landon's left. The choice was strategic, not ideological. It let him draw a sharp distinction between Landon and himself, In a time of crisis like the Depression, it was best to look resolute and strong, to stand for something firm, to oppose a clear enemy. The attacks from the right gave him that clear enemy, while Landon's milquetoast posturing made him look strong by contrast. Either way, he won. Now Landon was presented with a dilemma. If he kept going with his centrist appeal, he would bore the public and seem weak. If he moved to the right, the choice he actually took, he would be inconsistent and look desperate. This was pure maneuver warfare. Begin by taking a position of strength, in Roosevelt's case, his initial presidential bipartisan pose, that leaves you with open options and room to maneuver. Then, let your enemies show their direction. Once they commit to a position, let them hold it. In fact, let them trumpet it. Now that they are fixed in place, maneuver to the side that will crowd them, leaving them only bad options. By waiting to make this maneuver until the last 6 weeks of the presidential race, Roosevelt both denied the Republicans any time to adjust and kept his own strident appeal from wearing thin. Everything is political in the world today, and politics is all about positioning. In any political battle, the best way to stake out a position is to draw a sharp contrast with the other side. If you have to resort to speeches to make this contrast, you are on shaky ground. People distrust words. Insisting that you are strong or well qualified rings as self-promotion. Instead, make the opposing side talk and take the first move. Once they have committed to a position and fixed it in other people's minds, they are ripe for the sickle. Now you can create a contrast by quoting their words back at them, showing how different you are, in tone, in attitude, in action. Make the contrast deep. If they commit to some radical position, do not respond by being moderate. Moderation is generally weak. Attack them for promoting instability, for being power-hungry revolutionaries. If they respond by toning down their appeal, nail them for being inconsistent. If they stay the course, their message will wear thin. If they become more strident in self-defense, you make your point about their instability. Use this strategy in the battles of daily life. Letting people commit themselves to a position you can turn into a dead end. Never say you are strong, show you are, by making a contrast between yourself and your inconsistent or moderate opponents. 3. The Turks entered World War I on the side of Germany. Their main enemies in the Middle Eastern theater were the British, who were based in Egypt. But by 1917, they had arrived at a comfortable stalemate. The Turks controlled a strategic 800-mile stretch of railway that ran from Syria in the north to the Hejaz, the southwestern part of Arabia, in the south. Due west of the central part of this railway line was the town of Aqaba on the Red Sea, a key Turkish position from which they could quickly move armies north and south to protect the railway. The Turks had already beaten back the British at Gallipoli, see Chapter 5, a huge boost to their morale. Their commanders in the Middle East felt secure. The English had tried to stir up a revolt against the Turks among the Arabs of the Hejaz, hoping the revolt would spread north. The Arabs had managed a few raids here and there, but had fought more among themselves than against the Turks. The British clearly coveted Aqaba and plotted to take it from the sea with their powerful navy, but behind Aqaba was a mountain wall marked by deep gorges. The Turks had converted the mountain into a fortress. The British knew that even if their navy took Aqaba, they would be unable to advance inland, rendering the city's capture useless. Both the British and the Turks saw the situation the same way, and the stalemate endured. In June 1917, the Turkish commanders of the forts guarding Aqaba received reports of strange enemy movements in the Syrian deserts to the northeast. It seemed that a 29-year-old British liaison officer to the Arabs named T.E. Lawrence had trekked across hundreds of miles of desolate terrain to recruit an army among the Hawaitat, a Syrian tribe renowned for fighting on camels. The Turks dispatched scouts to find out more. They already knew a little about Lawrence. Unusually for British officers of the time, he spoke Arabic, mixed well with the local people, and even dressed in their style. He had also befriended Sheriff Faisal, a leader of the Arab revolt. Could he be raising an army to attack Aqaba? To the extent that this was possible, he was worth watching carefully. Then word came that Lawrence had imprudently told an Arab chief, secretly in Turkish pay, that he was heading for Damascus to spread the Arab revolt. This was the Turks' great fear, for a revolt in the more populated areas of the north would be unmanageable. The army Lawrence had recruited could not have numbered more than 500, but the Hawaitat were great fighters on camel, fierce and mobile. The Turks alerted their colleagues in Damascus and dispatched troops to hunt Lawrence down, a difficult task given the mobility of the Arabs and the vastness of the desert. In the next few weeks, the Englishman's movements were baffling, to say the least. His troops moved not north toward Damascus, but south toward the railway town of Ma'an, site of a storage depot used to supply Aqaba, 40 miles away. No sooner had Lawrence appeared in the area of Ma'an, however, than he disappeared, re-emerging over 100 miles north to lead a series of raids on the railway line between Amman and Damascus. Now the Turks were doubly alarmed and sent 400 cavalry from Amman to find him. For a few days there was no sign of Lawrence. In the meantime, an uprising several miles to the south of Ma'an surprised the Turks. An Arab tribe called the Dumanea had seized control of the town of Abu el-Lisal, directly along the route from Ma'an to Aqaba. A Turkish battalion dispatched to take the town back found the blockhouse guarding it destroyed, and the Arabs gone. Then suddenly something unexpected and quite disturbing occurred. Out of nowhere, Lawrence's Hawaitat army emerged on the hill above Abu el-Lisal. Distracted by the local uprising, the Turks had lost track of Lawrence. Now, linking up with the Dumanea, he had trapped a Turkish army at Abu el-Lisal. The Arabs rode along the hill with enormous speed and dexterity, goading the Turks into wasting ammunition by firing on them. Meanwhile, the midday heat took its toll on the Turkish riflemen, and having waited until the Turks were sufficiently tired, the Arabs, Lawrence among them, charged down the hill. The Turks closed their ranks, but the swift-moving camel cavalry took them from the flank and rear. It was a massacre. 300 Turkish soldiers were killed, and the rest taken prisoner. Now the Turkish commanders at Aqaba finally saw Lawrence's game. He had cut them off from the railway line on which they depended for supplies. Also, seeing the Hawaitat's success, other Arab tribes around Aqaba joined up with Lawrence, creating a powerful army that began to wend its way through the narrow gorges toward Aqaba. The Turks had never imagined an army coming from this direction. Their fortifications faced the other way, toward the sea and the British. The Arabs had a reputation for ruthlessness with enemies who resisted, and the commanders of the forts in back of Aqaba began to surrender. The Turks sent out their 300-man garrison from Aqaba to put a stop to this advance, but they were quickly surrounded by the swelling number of Arabs. On July 6th, the Turks finally surrendered, and their commanders watched in shock as Lawrence's ragtag army rushed to the sea to take what had been thought to be an impregnable position. With this one blow, Lawrence had completely altered the balance of power in the Middle East. Interpretation. The fight between Britain and Turkey during World War I superbly demonstrates the difference between a war of attrition and a war of maneuver. Before Lawrence's brilliant move, the British, fighting by the rules of attrition warfare, had been directing the Arabs to capture key points along the railway line. This strategy had played into Turkish hands. The Turks had too few men to patrol the entire line, but once they saw the Arabs attacking at any one place, they could quickly move the men they had and use their superior firepower to either defend it or take it back. Lawrence, a man with no military background, but blessed with common sense, saw the stupidity in this right away. Around the railway